Today in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about Robert's Rules of Order, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the details of what a motion is, how to make a motion, all those things that you hear on Senate floor during Wednesday night meetings. And then we're going to end by talking a little bit about the different kinds of motions and how they show up during speech and debate on the council floor. Just to take you through a little bit of kind of the background of Robert's Rules and Order super quickly. When I talk about Robert's Rules, I always start with this graphic because I think it's funny. And this actually happened to me in real life one day when someone kind of just raised their hand in meeting and said, who is Robert and why did he get to make the rules? So I like to just kind of give folks a super brief background of Robert's Rules of Order. And so this was actually written by a man named Henry Robert III. He was an army major who became an army general. And back in the 1800s, they didn't have a good way to run meetings. And he said, okay, so let me come up with a way to help people make meetings more efficient. And so what was born then was Robert's Rules of Order. I actually own the second edition, fun fact, of the book on my desk in my office. So if we are ever back in person in real life, then you are welcome to come by and take a sneak peek. We are now on the 11th edition, and so the content in today's presentation is going to be based on the 11th edition of Robert's Rules of Order, with the preface that the 12th edition is coming out very shortly and goes into effect this fall. And so the 12th edition of Robert's Rules of Order will have some pretty significant changes that we will immediately adopt as an organization based on our constitution and our standing rules. And so there will be a fall revision to our Robert's Rules training once we get into all of those details. But for the purposes of right now, this will kind of give you a really good overview of what Robert's Rules of Order look like. Just as a heads up, if you hear people say RONR, it's Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, so it's RONR. That's the RONR. And my biggest complaint about the stuff that's out there about Robert's Rules is it always looks something like this, where you have these flow charts that make absolutely no sense. You take a look at this document and you're just like, where does one thing start and where does another thing end? There's just not a lot of detail in these charts, or you get these like precedent flow charts where like none of this stuff makes sense. And so I want to kind of just like throw all of that aside today and really just kind of drive a few key points home. And the central focal point of all of this, right, and kind of the example that I'll kind of keep going back to is the singular concept of a motion. And the concept of a motion is really simple. We see motion in our day-to-day life, and it's when something moves, right? We see motion when you knock a water bottle over. We see motion when a car is driving, right? And whether intended or unintended, they are all driven by something. And in council meetings, this is similar, right? Your purpose, your vision, your why is what is driving these different emotions. But I just kind of want to briefly introduce what emotion is. And a main emotion, right, the simple at its core, the simplest kind of idea of what emotion is it's a way for you to do something. It's your voice as a Senate member or as a member in any deliberative assembly to say, I want to do something. And so it's a way for you to introduce a piece of legislation or a piece of business, and it cannot happen when another motion is on the floor, right? And so this is kind of the first part of where you'll see the order piece of Robert's Rules really tries to promote order. You can't talk about two things at the same time. So an example that I jokingly like to give is you can make a move to approve the allocation of $200,000 to buy me a house. And that is someone wanting to do something, and you can make a motion to do that. And at any point, at the right time in the meeting, probably during new business or during one of our committee times, you can make a motion to make this kind of allocation. The key point here about not being able to do something while something else is happening is if we're talking about spending $200,000 to buy me a house, then we can't start talking about allocating $200,000 to buy Heather a house, right? Like we're talking about my house first, and then we can move on to another house after that. Does that, hopefully that lands with you all? And something that I'll kind of just briefly allude now that I'll say probably at least one more time throughout this video is this concept of motion versus move. A motion is a very simple way to talk about something that someone has introduced on Senate floor. And so in its simplest form, a motion can be a piece of legislation to pass a funding allocation, or it can be a resolution, it can be a letter. A motion is basically you saying you want to pass something, you saying you want to do something, and you state it in the noun format, right? Like the senator made a motion. The motion on the table is XYZ. But when you are the person actually making the motion, you want to use the verb, which is move. And so you move to approve the allocation. I move to approve the resolution. I move to approve the letter. I move to extend time. I move to limit time. I move to amend. When you are the one doing it, you don't say I motion to, right? That would be grammatically incorrect. You move to do the thing. But then once you're talking about someone else's motion, then you would use the noun form motion. I like to kind of give an example of how this plays out during the Wednesday night meeting. So I'm going to take you all through kind of a brief example of how this will come up during a Wednesday night meeting. Say we're a new business. It's Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. We're a new business, and someone wants to pass a piece of legislation, right? So you would need a main motion, and then you would need a second. And so what that would look like is I move to fund something in full, right? And so on the Senate floor, that might look like I move to approve an allocation of $5,000 from student org unallocated to XYZ organization's fall event. And then what happens is there needs to be a second. And what the second is basically the 1800s version of the word same. Basically you saying like, yep, I agree with you. That is the motion that I would have also made, or yep, I would vote yes on that piece of legislation. Like, I am seconding you. I am in agreement with you. And this is another time that it kind of goes back to that the kind of pillars of Robert's rules of this is really intended to be a way for anyone can make a motion, right? Anyone has a voice, but you need at least one other person to agree with you, because otherwise what is being implied is you're the only person that wants to do that. And so every motion needs a second, and if it doesn't have a second, the motion automatically dies. Once it receives a second, the speaker will go on to ask for objections. And so it'll start with, the speaker will say something as simple as, are there any objections? And if there are no objections, we move on, right? And the reason for that is because if no one else disagrees, then why are we going to spend time talking about it? If no one else disagrees, we're just gonna go on and pass the thing. This is something that I like to highlight because not every organization does this. Something unique about Robert's Rules is that it's meant to be adapted for every organization. And so I know some college councils will immediately go into a discussion and then go to a vote. That is not how it's done in AS, because in our peak season, we can have over 100 pieces of legislation on our Wednesday night order of business. And so we, in order to increase the efficiency, we ask for objections. And if there's no objections, something passes. If there's an objection, we open up the speakers list. And so the speaker of the meeting, the chairperson of the meeting, will open up the speakers list, and the order goes like this. You start with the person who made the motion. So if a motion receives an objection, then we go into debate. And the way that we go about debate is in a very particular order, and it's here up on the screen. And so it starts with the person who made the motion. The person who wanted to do the thing should always get their voice heard first, and kind of a brief presentation of this is why I wanted to pass this. Then the person who objected will be the person who gets to speak on why they don't agree with that motion, and then we start the speakers list. And our rules actually provide that every person gets 3 minutes per person during the debate, and so that is something that the speaker will be keeping track of, and every organization might do that differently. So for example, Rebel Council might have a 5-minute per person debate, and Marshall, TMCSC, Thurgood Marshall College Student Council might have a 2-minute per person during debate time limit. That's organization specific, so check your standing rules or your bylaws for those details. So the speakers list is organized the speakers list is split up between those who haven't spoken and those who have spoken. The people who haven't spoken will always get priority. And to kind of give you a rundown of what that looks like is, so say King Triton and AS Bear get on the speakers list and the anchor. So 3 people get on the speakers list. AS Bear is first on the speakers list, so they speak. And then King Triton goes second, and then they speak. And then say after King Triton spoke, the AS Bear decides, ooh, I have a rebuttal point to that. I need to get on the speakers list again. They'll raise their hand, but this time they'll get put into the spoken list instead of the not spoken list. But who will get called on next is actually the anchor, right? Because what will happen is we will prioritize always the people who have not spoken over the people who have spoken. So what you all see on the screen right now is kind of just a printout or a screen capture of a typical printout that you'll get for Parley Pro at a glance. And what I want to do with you all really quickly is just help break it down of what exactly are you looking at. The table that you're specifically looking at is one that I put together that I've compiled across a lot of different other tables because there was just not one centralized table where everything was laid out together. And so my recommendation is to keep this file handy. It's in the AS share drive, so just reference it regularly, keep it handy. Some of this stuff will also be on the back of your name placard, so if we ever do go back into in-person meetings, there's a short version of this on the back of your name placard. But for the virtual meetings that we're having right now, feel free to just kind of reference this as meeting is happening. So a couple of things that I'll just kind of draw your attention to on this document is on the left-hand side right here, you'll see that motions are laid out in a particular order. So in Robert's Rules of Order, there's an order of precedent, meaning that certain motions can happen at a time when other motions cannot. And so the example that we started with today was the main motion. When you are talking about one thing, you cannot talk about a second thing, right? You can't, because once you're talking about one thing, for the purposes of order, we don't start the second discussion. But you can decide to never talk about it again, postpone it indefinitely, or you can choose to amend something, meaning you can choose to change a little bit what you're talking about. Now, when we amend something, again, we can't just change the entire topic, right? If we're talking about buying me a house, we can't start talking about buying Heather a house, but we can do something like, say, change the amount from $200,000 to $1 million to buy a nicer house. And the speaker is the kind of the person that gets to make the call as a heads up on if something is similar enough or too different of a topic. And so there is actually a decent amount of power that lies in the speaker in controlling the flow of the meeting. The flow, and so that's the first thing that I'll kind of just draw your attention to is the order of precedent that exists in our motions. The highest order of precedent is the motion to adjourn a meeting. The reason why it's at the highest order of precedent is because, say, the fire alarm in the 4th floor goes off if we were meeting in the forum. Technically speaking, the meeting is still in session, and so someone would need to make a motion to adjourn for the meeting to adjourn, and then we would all walk out in a orderly fashion. Now, I say that in a semi-joking fashion. If the fire alarm ever does go off, or if there is a threat to your personal health or safety, get the hell out of the room that you're in. But it is technically why the motion to adjourn has the highest order of precedent. And there was a Senate meeting back in, I believe that was 2018, that a senator did try to make a motion to adjourn where the fire alarm went off, and I got a chuckle out of it, and you all made, well, that Senate made me proud, but that's a fun story for another time. The second thing that I'll note about the chart is it gives both the purpose of the motion as well as how to do it. And so if you're ever wondering, how do I fail something? How do I postpone something indefinitely? There's pretty much a script for you here to say, I moved that the motion be postponed indefinitely, or I moved for the motion to be tabled indefinitely. There's pretty much a way for you to look at this chart and get a sense of how exactly do I say something to make something happen. There's also a column for when is something out of order. And so pretty much for all of these, you'll be able to see that anytime there's a motion below that's pending, you can't make that motion, but that's just something for you to have. Now, something that's important that I kind of like to draw attention to is the debatable and the vote kind of column. Not every motion in Robert's rules is debatable. And the reason for that is because we don't sometimes talk about if we want to talk about something. And what do I mean by that? I realize that's kind of a circular statement. We don't talk about motions to extend time, for example. Say we're talking about, we're hearing a special presentation, and the special presentation has gone on for 15 minutes, so we've hit the 15-minute mark. Because it's 15 minutes for the presentation and 5 minutes for the Q&A. But say we've hit the 15-minute mark and we want to keep on hearing from the presenter because it's a really engaging presentation or it's a really important topic and we really need to get all of the content. Someone can make a motion to extend time by 10 minutes. That motion is not debatable because we're not going to then spend 10 minutes talking about if we need to extend our time limit by 10 minutes. If someone objects to extending time by 10 minutes, we immediately go to a vote and then we move on with our day, right? And so not every motion is debatable. So if you ever need to check on if a motion is debatable, that is what the debatable column is good for. And as a general rule of thumb, basically speaking, we basically never debate something that relates to if we're going to keep on talking about something. So those are things like going immediately to a vote, extending time, postponing the discussion of something, all of those different things. We also have different voting thresholds, and that's something that I like to draw our attention to. For the most part, for the absolute most part, the voting threshold for most motions and most items on the agenda is a simple majority, meaning simply more than 50%. And I always need to give this clarification. It is not 50% plus one. It is simply more than 50%. And so anything that requires a simple majority just needs more than 50%. But there are times that we need a 2/3 majority. And the times that we need a 2/3 majority also deal with people's rights to speak. And so again, this is actually really progressive of Robert's rules because it is protecting the voices of the people who have not spoken, or is careful or cautious of giving someone too much time to speak. Anytime we need to extend time, limit time, go immediately straight to a vote, it is giving more voice to a particular population or limiting or prohibiting certain people from speaking. And as a result, those voting thresholds require a 2/3 because you're increasing or decreasing the rights of certain council members. It's a 2/3 majority, so again, it's not 2/3 plus one, it's just simply more than 2/3, which is like 0.666666. You'll always see us during meeting with a little calculator doing the math to make sure that we hit that percentage. One thing that I'll also just kind of quickly talk about here is how votes are being tabulated. So during meetings, you'll hear the speaker ask for all those in favor, all those opposed, and any abstentions. Abstentions don't count. And what we mean by that is, say something just needs a simple majority. Okay, so it's a main motion. We are talking about a student org allocation of $3,000. It only needs a simple majority of those who voted. And so if you abstain, you don't count. And so if the voting breakdown is 2 voted yes, 1 voted no, and 30 people abstained, that thing still passes because if you abstained, you basically didn't count for that moment. And the vote was 2-1, which is more than 50%. And so that item would pass. And so take that as you will. You know, some people feel strongly about abstaining, some people sometimes, but just letting you know that if you abstain, your vote did not count and your voice did not count in that particular moment. The other thing is kind of standards around abstaining. So some college councils say, if I make the motion, then I have to abstain. That is not the case in AS. If you make the motion, you can vote yes, because theoretically speaking, you propose the item and therefore you are already in favor of it. You do not have to abstain when you make the motion. But I know that is the case in some college councils where if you made the motion, you do have to abstain. That's not the case here. Lastly, you'll notice that on this chart, all of these motions are non-interruptible, meaning if someone is talking, you can't just hop in here and interrupt them, okay? I put this on here to drive the point home. There are motions in the Robert's Rules book that are interruptible, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit. But generally speaking, the motions that you use on a day-to-day basis are not considered interruptible. So if someone else is talking, let them finish, don't interrupt, with these motions in this table at least. And if you wanted to make these motions, the way you would do that is you would raise your hand. Literally in the meeting, on both in Zoom, you would hit raise hand, or in real life, you would hold your placard up. You'll notice that the speaker will then take your name down on the speakers list. And then when the speaker calls on you, then you can make the motion. So earlier I mentioned that Robert's Rules of Order has 4 different kinds of motions. And so we're gonna talk a little bit about what these different kinds of motions are. We're not gonna get into the nitty gritty of for subsidiary motions this, or for incidental motions that. You don't have to worry about all of those details, but just to kind of give you a brief overview, because it is part of the overview of Robert's Rules, there's 4 motions. So on this screen, I have a couple of different motions that I'll just be zooming through with you all, literally, for the next couple of minutes. But just so you have a sense of it, subsidiary motions are motions that are basically subsidiary to the main motion, and it changes how you deal with the main motion. And so the really common one here that I'm actually going to kind of show you all is the motion to amend. So the motion to amend basically modifies a main motion, right? And so it requires a second. It's debatable because it's changing essentially someone's main motion. The motion to amend can be a lot of different things. And so the common ones are dollar amounts when we're talking about a funding allocation, or it can be also something along the lines of changing the words in a resolution, right? We're on Senate floor and we're wordsmithing a specific resolution, and we decide we don't like this word, so we're going to move to amend the 3rd line of the document to take out this word and substitute it with another word. Motions need to be very specific, and so you need to be pretty clear if you're changing a dollar amount or the words with what exactly you want to do. Because the speaker is technically, for all intents and purposes, neutral, they can interpret it. So say you decide, I don't think the student org should get $5,000. I move to amend that amount and reduce it by a little bit. That's not good enough. You need to be very specific of, I want to reduce the amount by $1,000. So instead of $5,000, we're now allocating $4,000. Another kind of subsidiary motion is the subsidiary motion to table something indefinitely. Table something indefinitely is basically another way for us to fail something. And the motion to table something indefinitely is the positive way of saying that. In Robert's Rules, we never use the negative form. So we never say, I want to fail this, I move to fail this. Instead, you table something indefinitely. At this point, I'm going to draw on the point that in Robert's Rules, there's always this metaphorical table. I actually really don't know the historical origins behind this, but I imagine it's like in the House. I think there's like a Hopper is at the Senate. I'm clearly not a poli-sci person. But there's this metaphorical table, and so when you table something indefinitely, it just basically sits there forever, and we never talk about it again. It does require a second, and this is debatable. This is one of those times where we are going to talk about whether or not we talk about something. Of one of the few times we're going to talk about whether or not we're going to talk about something, because if this passes, if the motion to table something indefinitely passes, we never talk about it again. Next up is the motion to table something temporarily, right? And this comes up in 2 different ways. You can move to table something for 2 weeks back to committee, and what that means is basically, we're not ready to talk about this right now. We need to wait 2 weeks to get some more information to talk to, and then we'll revisit this. And you'll notice here that this is not debatable, because this is an example of, we're not gonna talk about whether or not we're gonna talk about this right now. We're just gonna kind of put it aside for a moment. And this is another subsidiary motion because it basically says, we're gonna come back to this eventually. And then we start getting into ways that we handle business. So there are 2 other kinds of motions in Robert's Rules. There are privileged motions and there's incidental motions. Privileged motions are basically changing the way that we handle something. And it basically means that if something needs greater privilege or greater consideration, then they're privileged. And so changing people's amount of time to speak, limiting or extending the amount of time they have to debate, is one of those ways that we can change people's privilege. This requires a 2/3 voting threshold to pass because it is a motion that changes people's rights. But it is not something that is debatable because we're not going to basically talk about whether or not We want to talk about something. And then you have the motion to call the question. The motion to call the question basically says, we're done talking about this. We are ready to kind of wash our hands of this, move on, go straight to a vote. So say we're in a speakers list, there's 20 people on the speakers list. We're in our third hour of debate on this very specific motion. And people are like, we're being circular. We've talked about, people are making the same points over and over and over again. Let's move on. You can make the motion to call the question. So you can say, I move to call the question. Some people will say, I call the question. I've also heard I move the previous question, meaning the main motion. Those are all valid ways of saying that. And that's basically you saying, let's go straight to a vote. And this requires a 2/3 because you would essentially be silencing all the people on the speakers list. But it's a way for us to kind of wrap things up and go straight to a vote. And this is commonly used, especially when we feel like the conversation points are starting to get a little bit circular. And lastly, there are the motions to divide the question. And so this is kind of an example of when we need to split the motions up. This one is done at least twice a year because we consider our budget two times in the year. When we talk about the budget is this like 5-page document that allocates $7 million worth of money. We divide the question because we consider pieces of the legislation part by part, and then we go back to the larger document as a whole. And so when you make a motion to divide the question, you're basically considering the legislation piece by piece. Another time that you'll hear this is when a exec member during reports of standing committee says, I move to approve F1, F2, F3, F4, F5. And you decide, F3 is really questionable. A lot of people here need to talk about F3, but F1, 2, 4, and 5 are okay. Then you can say, all right, I move to divide the question between 1, 2, 4, 5, and 3. And you divide those questions up, and if that's passed, then council will first, or Senate will first consider 1, 2, 4, 5, and then they'll come back to consider F3. The last part that we kind of wanted to talk you all through are some common phrases. These common phrases are also part of what are considered as incidental motions. They're considered incidental because they bring up incidences that happen during Senate meeting. And so a common one is a point of privilege. Point of privileges are basically dealing with your personal ability to participate in the meeting. In board meetings, in the actual corporate world, people make points of privilege when we need the AC to be turned down a little bit, when the projector screen needs to be brightened a little bit. In the Zoom world, sometimes it means the wrong projection or share screen is being made. Will the speaker please switch it? And things like that. It deals with your ability to participate, or point of privilege, I can't see the resolution. Can you zoom it in a little bit on the share screen? Things like that. Points of information are things that are directed at the speaker, and it deals with the procedural elements of it all. And so if you need a little bit information to get an understanding of how to do things, you make a point of information. Point of informations include things like, speaker, can you please tell us what we're discussing right now? What's the motion? Or a point of information, can you please help us understand what the voting threshold is and how many votes do we need to pass something? Something that I'll talk about here quickly is in some organization, points of information can be used to ask questions about the subject matter, meaning point of information, can you help me understand why they need $3,000, right? In AS, that is not the case, and in a true Roberts Rules fashion, the point of information is just used for procedural aspects, and so don't use it to skip the speakers list, right? Point of information, can you give me some more information on XYZ? No, get on the speakers list and ask the question. It's also not used for you to interject things. And so some people, or in some councils, and college councils will do this, point of information, just so everyone knows, this organization needs $3,000 to buy food, not materials, right? That's you giving a talking point. You cannot give a talking point using the point of information. The point of information is used to ask questions to the speaker. There's two other things that also draw out are the point of order and germaneness. So when someone does something that's out of order, you can call that out by saying point of order. This is something that is interruptible because if it's not in order, we need to draw attention to it pretty much right away. And related to that is germane. So if something is not relevant, you can either use a point of order or you can simply just say the word germane, right? Senator so-and-so, I don't believe your point is germane because, so the example that kind of commonly comes up is, if we're talking about a funding allocation. The funding allocation is to allocate, we're going to kind of keep on going with this, $5,000 to a student organization for an event. If we start talking about funding another student organization, that's not germane. Now, say another senator comes in here and makes a motion to amend the amount from 5,000 to 3,000, and we go into debate about that. At that point, we need to be talking about the amendment, not about the organization as a whole. So the points of debate need to be, do we reduce it down to 3,000 or do we reduce it, or do we keep it at 5,000? And if something isn't relevant to that specific conversation, then you can yell germane, and the speaker will basically gently remind Senate that we should be talking about the amendment specifically. So I know that was a lot of content, and there was a lot of rules and a lot of procedures and a lot of stuff. Robert's Rules of Order is a over 600-page booklet that's about like 2 inches thick. It's not something that anyone expects you to become a master of overnight. And it becomes a lot easier with time in Senate. Throughout the first couple of weeks in the fall, the speaker will be a little bit more gracious and give a little bit more instruction and provide a little bit more clarification, because we know it's confusing and we don't expect you to know it all. But know that with practice, some of this will become like second nature. And the hope is that this is one of those good takeaways that you can just kind of take with you through the rest of your life, because Robert's Rules comes up in a lot of different corporate, board, organizational spaces. And so we hope that this is something that you'll be able to utilize in the future as well. This is just a small snippet of what Robert's Rules of Order has, and the 12th edition is coming out, so there will be a little bit more for us to learn together as a whole as we move through fall and the rest of this upcoming year. If you have any questions about Robert's Rules of Order, please feel free to reach out to ask me, to ask our speaker, or any other professional staff member during Senate meetings. If anything ever gets confusing, always feel free to message me using the Zoom chat feature, or shoot me a text on the side, send me an email, set up a time to chat. I'm happy to talk through any piece of this with you in further detail. I hope